Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast / Election Cast studio.
And it's Alex in the makeshift home election cast studio.
And it's James in the lovely Newscast Glasgow studio.
And it's Felicity in the Cardiff newsroom.
Standing up in the middle of your office, whereas we're all in our very bespoke studios. Right, I've got one more Remota voter for you all. Mark says, hello, Newscast. I'm not a current Remota voter, but 5 years ago, I was taken into hospital a week before the election for emergency heart surgery. It was planned surgery, but it kept getting delayed because of COVID and the lack of intensive care beds. The surgery was very long. I ended up having a stroke and was unable to walk or speak. I had no visitors because of COVID. On the 6th day in intensive care, I FaceTimed my husband and whispered, get me a proxy vote. Now, I lived in Sussex and had the surgery in London, so it wasn't really a huge distance that wins any tickets for Castfest as the remotest voter, but the barriers were significant. So, well done, Mark, for your commitment to democracy, and hope you are feeling much better than you did 5 years ago. Right, let's talk about the elections in Scotland, Wales and England. Alex, the story we've all been covering as political journalists, though, is Keir Starmer and the effect on his premiership of the whole Mandelson story. Do you think that is playing out on the campaign trail in the locals?
Yeah, I mean, totally. That is the massive dominant story in Westminster. And it's always really hard to assess in any kind of scientific sense how much impact that will or won't have on the campaign trail. But there's one person who certainly seems to think it's having an impact, and that's the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, because he gave an interview to the FT in which he said he thinks his party risks being, in his word, stonked during these elections. And he put that in large part down to what he called the omnishambles around this whole process of Peter Mandelson's appointment and then everything we've seen since around the vetting process. And his argument was that that makes it hard to talk about on the doorstep with voters what he says are, in his view, the good things that the Labour Party is doing. And I think that probably is the kind of really salient point, because you hear that from everybody. You hear it from Labour MPs, you've heard it from ministers who said it on the airwaves. Whatever their view is on what happened with Peter Mandelson, and there are some really pretty strong views around the way that that has all been dealt with, the one thing they all totally agree on is the fact that it is stopping them talking about other stuff, and if you remember right at the beginning of the year, Keir Starmer was saying, if there's a day where I'm not talking about the cost of living, then it's a sort of, day wasted, or a day when I don't want to be doing that. And obviously what they are talking about constantly is what's going on, or what has been going on, with Peter Mandelson. And I suspect from a sort of voting perspective, again, whatever people think about what's happened with Peter Mandelson, however that might influence or shape their views, there are other issues that they will have at the top of their own agenda as well: cost of living, NHS, public services, all those things that we've talked about. So I think, as well as Labour MPs and Keir Starmer and cabinet ministers recognising that this has been a damaging episode, what it has also been is massive distraction from the issues that a lot of people really care about.
Oh, and Alex, that mention of Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, is a useful reminder that even though there are some mayors up for election in England this time round, it's not the metro mayors or the Mayor of London that's up for grabs.
No, that's right. That's right. So they're in a couple of years' time. So they're not standing for election this time. There's just a handful of other mayoralties that are up, as well as all the council elections that are up in England. But obviously, you're going to get figures out on the campaign trail like Sadiq Khan. It's worth saying, while I'm talking about what Sadiq Khan said, I should say that he also said in that interview with the FT, he didn't think Keir Starmer should go, but he was highly critical of the impact all of this has had in his experience on what he's finding out there on the doorstep.
But James, somebody who did say that Keir Starmer should go was Anna Sarwar, Labour's leader in Scotland, and that sort of was designed to be a bit of an insurance policy during this campaign. Has the insurance policy paid out?
Well, that is obviously in the hands of the voters in the end, but I think I can answer it to a certain extent, Adam. Is Sir Keir Starmer's very high unpopularity in polls a drag on Scottish Labour's prospects in this election? Yes, of course it is. And we were talking about a party that went from 1 seat to 39 in the general election 2 years ago, while the Scottish National Party fell from 48 seats to 9. So there was clearly a huge swell of, if not necessarily confidence in Sir Keir as a prospective Prime Minister, an opportunity for him to convince voters that he could be a good Prime Minister. There's clearly enough people in Scotland saying, we will give you a shot. Polls since then suggest that people have been disappointed in him. And has that been a drag on Anas Sarwar? Yes. Did Anas Sarwar take a significant risk when he called for the Prime Minister to go? Yes. But one former Director of Communications for the party, Alan Roden, I heard him on Radio Scotland Breakfast, I think yesterday or the day before. I thought he made quite a good point, Adam, which is he was saying, look, what Anas Sarwar has done here is stop this campaign being, just what you and Alex were talking about there, being entirely focused on the Prime Minister and the state of the UK government. Because yes, he is asked about it, Anas Sarwar, repeatedly by journalists, but it doesn't dominate every single appearance. He's not asked about it from start to end of a news conference. And he was asked about it this morning by my colleague Katie Hunter, interviewing him for BBC Breakfast. And he said, I stand by my call for, I stand by what I said, I don't recall from it. The Mandelson scandal was the tipping point, but that's not what this election is about. And what this former Director of Communications for the party in Scotland was saying is that he has more space in the air war, to use that in political term, to get his message across, because he's not completely focused on that. And he also has more space on the ground war, because when he knocks on a door and someone says, oh, come on, I can't be bothered with that Prime Minister, he can say, I'm not saying he literally says these words, but he can say, yeah, well, neither can I, and you know that. But let's not talk about that. Let's talk about the SNP. So I think it has created some space for him. But will it be enough space? I mean, that's in the hands of the voters.
And Felicity, how's that massive news story been reflected in Wales?
Well, it's not dominating doorstep conversations from what I hear, Adam. I mean, we've talked previously, haven't we, about how Labour here is labouring under this burden of double incumbency. They're trying to defend a 27-year record in government at a Welsh level, and also Keir Starmer is very unpopular at a UK level, and he is also representing the Labour Party, so, you know, he's a bit of a ball and chain around the ankle as well. What one Labour source said, quite interestingly actually, a few days ago, was that Donald Trump is the name that they're finding getting brought up spontaneously the most. Keir Starmer is getting mentioned. A lot of people who mention him don't particularly like him, but this source was saying he was getting a little bit of credit, albeit maybe begrudgingly, for the way he's handled Donald Trump and the Iran war situation, but that the latest wave of criticism over the Peter Mandelson affair and the vetting situation seems to have wiped out that credit that he was previously getting, that kind of Iran bump, if you like. So it certainly hasn't done Labour any good here, although it doesn't seem to be dominating the conversation.
And Felicity, we were talking about intra-party tensions between leaders with James and with Keir Starmer and Anas Sarwar. I hear that there's a bit of tension amongst the Lib Dems between Ed Davey and his Welsh counterpart.
Yes, that's right. So Lib Dem social media at the end of last week showed that Ed Davey, the UK Lib Dem leader, had come to Cardiff with the lead candidates for those two constituencies there to do a little bit of a visit, you know, and all that sort of thing, as often happens during an election campaign. The Welsh Lib Dem leader, Jane Dodds, was not there. And when asked about it, she said, oh, she had other commitments and the Ed Davey visit had been sort of a last-minute arrangement, but there isn't a great deal of love lost between the two of them. And when Jane Dodds was pressed on, you know, how their relationship was, she said, and I quote, "It's a private matter," which is possibly not the thing to say to a journalist, because journalists always want to know what the private matters are, of course. It looks as if all this is rooted in something that happened a few years back, in that before she got into politics, Jane Dodds was a social worker, and for a time she worked for the church in England. And a report came out a few years ago that did criticise her handling in a sex abuse scandal in the church. At the time, Jane Dodds admitted that there had been shortcomings. Now, Ed Davey suggested at that time that Jane Dodds should consider her role as leader of the Welsh Liberal Democrats, interpreted by most people, I think, as a suggestion that she should think about standing down. Jane Dodds said she wasn't going to do that. She was going to stay put, and stay put she has. But it doesn't look as if the relationship has recovered from that, really.
Right, then into kind of nitty-gritty politics. Alex, I hear there's rumours, not of tactical voting in one area of Hampshire, but like tactical candidates.
Yeah, so there's loads about this story on the BBC News website, so you can read the whole thing on there, but I'll give you the kind of shortened version. And it is the case that in Havant, if you're going to vote in the wards in Havant that are up for election this year, the choice on the ballot paper is between Reform UK, Conservatives, and then one of Labour, Liberal Democrats or Greens. So the accusation, as Emily reports it, from the Conservatives and Reform is that the Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, who are currently in a rainbow coalition running Havant Council, have sort of decided not to pit against each other in this election campaign. Now, the parties that she's spoken to say, hang on, no, that's not the case. Actually, this is about the fact that we couldn't necessarily get enough candidates on the ballot paper. This isn't some sort of deal that we've struck, but that is the claim from the other parties standing there. And it just sort of brought to mind for me, do you remember, Adam, back before the 2017 general election, when there was all that talk about the notion of a progressive alliance and our party's going to kind of stand aside for each other so that they're not competing against each other in the hope of blocking the kind of opposition. And obviously, when you speak to parties at a national level, they never say they're doing that. There's nothing kind of formalized about that. You know, it's very rare that you get that kind of like open pact about pre-election progressive alliances or alliances of any description, because parties are obviously mostly out for all the votes they can get for their own party. But it's a fascinating little insight into what is happening in that little corner of Hampshire.
And James, okay, it's not about non-aggression pacts during the campaign, but the nature and the structure of Scottish politics means that which party might work with which other parties after the election is actually a quite regular feature.
Yeah, that's right, Adam. And it is always, I suppose, worth pausing, as you suggest, and remembering that Holyrood has an element of proportional representation, and that means attaining a majority is extremely difficult, pretty much by design. The whole concept of devolution, as far back as its founding in 1999, was the idea of making a more collegiate politics. As we've said before, our election casters, if you will, can decide for themselves whether or not that's happened. But that is the background. And within that, we've had arguments about whether an Asarwar would be able to form what would effectively be a bloc of pro-union MSPs, because as we know, in Scotland, politics very often comes to this dividing line along the constitution, with pro-independence, SNP and the Greens on one hand, and pro-union parties on the other. Despite a lot of people not being happy with that, it often happens. So the question is, can Anas Sarwar become First Minister with enough votes from other parties who support the union? And would that include Reform UK? Would he take Reform UK votes to become First Minister? I mean, you don't get to choose who votes for you. If you're nominated, and then whoever votes for you vote for you. There is definitely a question about arithmetically, was one poll suggested that might be a possibility that there could be a pro-union majority in Parliament. No one is talking, least of all in Asarwar, about the idea of any sort of formal coalition at all with Reform. He says there would be absolutely no deals. There was a row about this because, Malcolm Offord, the leader of Reform in Scotland, had said, oh, you said to me you wanted to work together and to get rid of the SNP, and he'd said that's not true. And they just basically are accusing each other of lying. But the question is, could he get the votes? But then even if he could get the votes, there is a further question, which is how stable would such a minority government be? Because the Labour Party and Reform UK and the Conservatives don't really agree on a great deal. So is that even a feasible position? And then the other question that's arisen this week is, could the leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, Alex Cole-Hamilton, be the kingmaker in the Parliament? And he was asked, would he support Anas Sarwar as a Labour First Minister? And he effectively indicated that pretty much he probably would. And asked by my colleague Laura McKeever on Radio Scotland Breakfast, would you support Malcolm Offord? No. Would you support Russell Findlay? No. So clear that if the Lib Dems are leaning in any direction, it would be towards the Labour Party. There have been, let's not forget, the first two terms of Holyrood from 1999 onwards, there were Liberal Democrat coalitions before the SNP swept everything before them from 2007 onwards. I say swept everything before them. They won by one vote that year, by one seat that year, is a majority of one. But still, the point being, it has happened in the past. Could it happen again in the future at this election, maybe, although it has to be said, even though the SNP's vote share, according to the polls, has dropped considerably since the last election, the polls also suggest that they are on track for being in the strongest position. But as I say again, it's up to the voters.
Also, James, thinking back to the ancient history of the Scottish Parliament of the 2000s is a reminder that actually Scotland went through a lot of First Ministers in that period. And actually it was the Alex Salmond, Nicola Sturgeon long period of stability that was actually kind of the outlier, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Donald Dewar died after a very relatively short period in office as the First Minister, to the distress, I think, in fairness, of everybody. A great tragedy for a man who'd spent his most of his political life, most of his life campaigning for the Parliament to be established, regarded as the father of devolution. Henry McLeish resigned over a scandal. Jack McConnell was then defeated at the ballot box. So, yes, they had 2 terms between those 3 First Ministers, but then there was a period of stability, Alex Salmond and then Nicola Sturgeon. And then, in fairness, the SNP fairly rattled through in the last couple of years as well, because you got Nicola Sturgeon and then Humza Yousaf very briefly, and now John Swinney trying to settle things down and calm things down.
And then, Felicity, the issue of tactical voting actually has been raised directly by Eluned Morgan in a video that she's posted on Instagram that you just sent us.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, we have a new voting system here in Wales, of course, and there are big question marks over the extent to which it makes tactical voting relevant, because the idea is that it's supposed to be more proportional than the old system. But having said that, it's not totally proportional. It favours bigger parties, and you probably need to get around about 12% or above in any constituency to start winning seats. The other interesting thing about it, and the thing that makes it very difficult, when the polls come out, they come out with vote share, they also come out with seat projections. The vote share, very interesting. The seat projections you have to take with a huge pinch of salt, because the 5th and certainly 6th seats in a lot of these constituencies could be decided by a whisker, and therefore make seat projections very, very difficult to make with any sort of accuracy at the moment. Now, what Eluned Morgan has done in her constituency in West Wales is try to explain all of this with a row of tinned or canned cocktails, all of them still unopened from what I can tell. And she's a strawberry daiquiri, by the way, in case you were wondering. I think from memory, the greens are a pina colada. Plaid Cymru are a mojito, and I'm not quite thirsty. Yeah, I know, not quite sure about what the other ones are, but her message appears to be that she's saying Plaid are a shoo-in in this constituency. She says she thinks they're going to get 2 seats and possibly 3, and she seems to be saying to the voters, look, my best hope of maintaining my seat is to come in that 6th seat. And if that's the case, I mean, it just shows really the way that Labour has apparently slid in the polls since the last Senedd election back in 2021. And she's basically saying to people, look, you need to get out and make sure you vote for me to make sure that I'm the person, I'm the strawberry daiquiri who gets that 6th seat. So, this could be tactical. This could be simply a message to try to persuade the voters out. It's a well-worn political device, isn't it, during election campaigns? You tell your troops we're in danger here, and they dig in harder and they get out and they vote. It could be that. On the other hand, it could be that she can see which way the wind is blowing. We've had a flurry of polls this week, Adam, all of them slightly different. One of them putting Plaid and Reform literally neck and neck in terms of who's going to be largest party after the election. But the broad trend for all of them is the same as it has been, which is Plaid Cymru and Reform duking it out for top spot, with Labour probably coming third. And for most of them, not all of them, but for most of them, Labour quite a distant third. So if that's the case, I mean, it does show what Eluned Morgan is facing in terms of the uphill struggle. And by the looks of it, she thinks even in her own seat.
Oh, Felicity, that talk of strawberry daiquiris, though, has reminded me of university when we'd go to this cocktail bar called the Duke of Cambridge, where they do 2-for-1 cocktails. And I'd always get a strawberry daiquiri, and I think some nights I'd drink like 10 strawberry daiquiris, and I've never had one since. So I haven't had a strawberry daiquiri for about 20 years.
I know, I'm the same with cider. So I wasn't as sophisticated as you, Adam. I wasn't going for the cocktails, but I can't look at cider
You just didn't
anymore.
have such good offers available. Also, James, in that video that Eluned Morgan posted, the Liberal Democrats are represented by a tin of Iron Brew Martini. Can you conceive of such a thing?
Sorry, what? Iron Brew Martini. I've never heard of such a thing, but I do empathise strongly with the cider situation. Yeah, definitely cider, and also peach schnapps. These are the two, the two that I can't go back to, really.
Alex, what was exciting you about that conversation? The tactical voting, the prospects for the results in Eluned Morgan's constituency, or the cocktail chat?
I thought of cocktails, to be honest, Adam.
Well, I mean,
it doesn't put me off.
We're recording this nearly past 5 p.m. Right, that's enough kind of strategic and tactical voting chat. What about actual issues? Alex, I know there's one in particular you would like to highlight.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I think so. I've been out and about a fair bit this week. Actually, I've been in Wales and in England just talking to people. And look, we've talked about it before, but when you go out and you ask the really open question to people on the streets or in the high streets or wherever else you are, you know, what are the things you really care about? It is overwhelming what comes out top. And it is public services. So it is the NHS, it is the economy, it is the cost of living, it is things like high streets, it is things like roads. And so I've been checking in with all of our brilliant colleagues across England who are covering these elections for BBC Local Radio and Regions and local and regional TV. And they are so in tune with what's happening on the ground, and they've been providing these really valuable insights. And the one thing that totally unsurprising to me keeps coming up time and time again is potholes, because, you know, I've just got this theory that sometimes these issues can be dismissed by some people, perhaps in Westminster, who think that they are very kind of localised. But I just think these are the things, these day-to-day frustrations that people have in their local communities, whether it's the high street or the state of the roads and potholes, that they kind of shape how people feel about whether the country is or isn't working to them. And therefore, that shapes their politics and their political views. So that is kind of topping the list, along with those other things to do with the immediate community, the state of public services. And broadly speaking, I think it all comes down to how people feel things are going, you know, in their pockets, in their wallets, in their local communities, in their towns, the high streets, housing, roads, and public services. Absolutely.
As a political journalist, can I just defend our class from the pothole allegation? Because it's one, and I've thought about this a lot, because potholes is one of those stories where the problem and the solution is just the same every year and every campaign, which is people say, oh, potholes are really bad, they're getting worse, or they get repaired and the repairs don't hold. And then central government says, here's more money for local authorities to fix potholes. And it's just that on an endless cycle. And things that are just staying the same all the time aren't really news, even though they can be real irritants in people's lives on quite a big scale.
Yeah, but then I guess the answer to that is, has the problem ever really been solved? Obviously, no, because of the state of the roads. And I would just say that it does, there are sort of different layers to it. So you can look at the amount of council funding that has been over periods of years and the impact that that has had on road maintenance and repair. And then if you really want to get into this, I did a whole documentary and about how actually when you get road repairs, so you have temporary road works for things like maybe utilities that need to be fixed, and then the quality of the road repairs, which then can have an impact on things like the road surface beyond that and potholes. So I mean, if you want...
I would add, Alex and Adam, one thing to that from the perspective of here. I totally agree with you, Alex, that there's a sort of vague idea of discontent generated by very irritating, but in some respects minor inconveniences such as potholes, which, by the way, are not really minor inconvenience if you have to get a tyre replaced. It might cost you a lot of money. And indeed, the guy in my local garage where I get my tyres done was saying he has made massively more money since COVID because the roads are in an obviously worse state, and that their profits have risen very substantially because the number of tyre repairs have jumped because of potholes. At the same time, there's a lot of politicians, I think, talk a lot. Some politicians, not all, but some politicians talk a lot about train travel or bus travel, and because, talking about putting into place measures to bring down the cost. And I think sometimes a lot of drivers feel that they are forgotten about. In Glasgow, for example, and this is not a local authority issue, this is a wider issue, there have been roadworks on the main motorway through Glasgow, the M8, for nearly 5 years in the same place. And there's this huge, I won't get into the whole row, but there's a huge row about what is going on and whether this bridge, it's about a bridge, whether it can be fixed or not, whether the entire motorway might have to be diverted. But it not only does it annoy people because they sit in traffic day in, day out fuming. I mean, I am slightly speaking from a personal perspective, but also it is a productivity issue as well. It's an issue, it ripples out into the economy, that sort of thing. So it has all sorts of different impacts, these things that seem maybe a little to begin with.
Felicity, I feel like I'm hosting a phone-in on local radio now. Is there anything you'd like to... And we've got Felicity in Cardiff. What would you like to complain about?
Well, I'd just like to chip in on this because, interestingly, potholes is something that Eluned Morgan, the Welsh Labour leader, does talk about a lot. And she has this figure, which I can't remember off the top of my head, and she quotes this figure for how many potholes have been filled in thanks to Welsh Government funding and all of that. And the pothole issue, it's very inconvenient for drivers and for cyclists, dangerous for cyclists, of course, but not just that. I feel that for a lot of people, when you go out and talk to them, they feel it's emblematic of what they see as a bit of a almost disintegration of the quality of the public realm, really, and that it's almost emblematic of what they feel might be happening, say, with other arguably more important public services, that this is something that you can see and feel on a daily basis that just reminds you that things are not how they should be. And just on the point about issues around roads and drivers and whatnot being something that really activates people. Of course, in Wales, we have this default 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, and that is something that's been fiercely controversial and fiercely contested, and is still something that Reform and the Welsh Conservatives refer to again and again and again in this campaign and say that they would get rid of. On the other hand, you have claims from other parties, obviously Labour, Plaid Cymru, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, who say that it's been an important measure for road safety and so on. But, that just shows how these issues can become totemic, really, and are almost something behind which some of the deeper issues almost stack up, or in the case of the pothole, fall in.
Very good. The election cast elves say that the Welsh Government say that 200,000 potholes have either been fixed or prevented by their action.
There is an issue with that statistic, as I recall, in that there is a question mark over exactly the accuracy of that statistic, and it is disputed. But yes, they do claim that they have filled in that many potholes for sure, or at least paid for them to be filled in. I don't think they've personally been out there with the shovels.
And how do you prevent a pothole?
I don't know.
Because they are including pothole prevention in there. The potholes that didn't happen. Right. Also, Felicity, talking about public services in Wales, was there some stats this week about NHS targets being missed?
Yes, that's right. So health is one of the biggest issues in this election campaign. Cost of living, of course, on everyone's minds. But health is also an issue that I'm told is coming up on the doorstep again and again and again. And it's particularly a big issue in North Wales, where the health board there has some of the worst waiting times in Wales. And of course, the Wales-wide performance of the NHS is something which has been criticised for some time. Now, the Welsh Government said that they wanted to get the overall waiting lists down to 600,000 by the spring, and they also said that they wanted to eradicate two-year waits. Now, two-year waits are virtually eradicated already in England, I believe, but you'll know the details on that. But the latest provisional figures have come out for March. I've written them down here because I knew I wouldn't be able to remember them. But what they show is that there were around 666,700 people waiting. So the Welsh Labour government has missed that target, and 2,600 waiting more than 2 years. So they have failed to hit those two targets in this final set of figures, really, before people go to the polls. Although, having said that, total numbers waiting for treatment now stand at their lowest since December 2021. So, Welsh Labour say that's a sign of progress. The other parties say it simply isn't good enough and that they have policies that would get to grips with this issue.
And James, the NHS waiting lists have been a feature of every leaders' debate in Scotland as well the last couple of weeks, haven't they?
Yeah, the same that Felicity's talking about in Wales applies in Scotland. It tends to be in the polling, cost of living's the number one issue, and the NHS is the next one below that. It's difficult, and we have a piece on the BBC website about this, trying to say, can you compare the NHS in Scotland with the rest of the UK? Because some politicians like to do that, and the short answer is, in lots of metrics, it's quite difficult. But Public Health Scotland estimate that 1 in 10 of Scotland's population was on at least one new outpatient, inpatient or day case waiting list as of a couple of months ago. And then one area that you can largely compare across the UK is A&E waiting times. The overall trend shows that all 4 nations in the UK have consistently missed their targets since the COVID pandemic. Scotland's performed slightly better than England and Wales, but it's still below its target. And in the campaign, to come to your question, Adam, there's been a lot of talk in various hustings and debates and so on about this. A lot of talk focusing on GP services. Just a quick rattle, very quickly rattled round the houses. SNP say they're expanding NHS walk-in centre pilots and they're bringing down waiting times as well. Labour's campaigned very heavily on one super hospital in Glasgow, the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, where there have been some deaths related to or said to be related to infections, and there's been campaigning on that. But they're also promising to end the rush for an 8 a.m. GP appointment with a new GP contract. The Conservatives also saying they would have a 48-hour guarantee for a GP appointment. The Lib Dems have talked about that issue for a long time as well, and they're also saying that they would reduce what's called delayed discharge. They would have it by the end of the decade as people who should be released, but there's nowhere to release them from hospital into because of social care and other failings. The Greens say they would defend the health service that's free at the point of need, and they would invest in general practice too. But what I think is striking, is to zoom right back out again, Adam, is that all of the parties, including Reform UK, insist that the National Health Service will remain free at the point of need and be fully funded by general taxation. And that's interesting when it comes to reform, because Nigel Farage, the UK leader of reform, has talked in the past about the possibility of the UK moving to some sort of European-style private medical insurance model, or at least partly that sort of model. And also it's interesting because if you talk to anybody in the health service in Scotland, almost anybody at all, they will tell you that the service needs dramatic and fundamental reform and is effectively not working, and that there is a de facto two-tier health service, because if people can afford to go private for treatment in some areas, they are doing so, and others just have to languish on these waiting lists. So has any politician in Scotland got to... I'm not saying that the answer is privatisation, just to be clear. It's not for me to say that at all, but I'm just saying it's striking that even a party that seems to be far more free market than any of the others in Reform UK, and to a certain extent the Conservatives, are not proposing that model, that everyone is sticking with this idea that someone once said, was it Nigel Lawson, that NHS is the closest thing that the British have to a national religion. And so it seems to be playing out again in this election campaign.
And James, I had a bit of a eureka moment, although it's kind of embarrassing eureka moment, when I was doing a thing for the BBC News streaming service the other day there, which was a sort of scene setter for the elections, which was on the day of the deadline for people to register to vote. And Professor Sir John Curtis, legendary number cruncher, was on. And he said, there's a very real prospect that we will have nationalist parties in government in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland for the first time ever. And I suppose that's kind of that's obvious that could be one of the outcomes. But it was just interesting hearing it just laid out like that by Sir John, because I hadn't quite joined all the dots. What do we think the consequences of that might be for our politics?
Well, it's such a good question, and it would be, as you say, like a fresh, new and very striking dynamic for a country that is arguably being pulled in different directions by different strands of nationalisms. And don't forget, I would argue that Reform UK, if not inherently being an English nationalist party, and the fact that it's polling well in Wales and Scotland suggests that it's at least something more than that, certainly it has its roots in traditions of English nationalism and possibly British nationalism as well. So you've got all these different nationalisms, and John Swinney's been asked about that this week, about, would you work with Plaid Cymru, which they've said before, and the SNP and Plaid Cymru have sort of long-standing, if not desperately formal, but long-standing links. They always address one another's conferences, for example. But would you also work with Sinn Féin? And historically, the SNP's been very wary, for obvious reasons, of drawing comparisons between the Irish nationalist movement and the Scottish nationalist movement. But he said he would, effectively, he said he would enjoy the cooperation of both Plaid Cymru in Wales and Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland. And the Conservatives have responded to that by saying, look, this is a wake-up call for people about the potential, as he puts it, threat to the union. And also for reform, very, very strong words from one of their senior figures in Scotland, Thomas Kerr, saying that the SNP were seeking a cooperation agreement with what he described as a terrorist sympathising party who were apologists for murderers. So just a reminder that those issues are not settled and that Irish politics does occasionally bleed into Scottish politics.
Felicity?
Well, worth mentioning that, as James says, of course, the SNP and Plaid have had, very warm, informal relationships with each other. We've had SNP speakers at Plaid Cymru conferences. We've also had Sinn Féin speakers at Plaid Cymru conferences, party conferences in the past. Just on that point about what happens if we have a Plaid government post-election, I mean, there are a lot of the parties are trying to make the independence issue a bigger issue than so far it appears to be in the election. Reform accuse Plaid Cymru of trying to bring in independence by stealth. The Liberal Democrats are saying, they wouldn't cooperate with any party that spent a penny of public money on trying to further independence. And Welsh Labour also having a go on the independence issue, as are the Welsh Conservatives. Plaid say, look, we are a pro-independence party. We have no plans to try to bring about a referendum in this term of the Senedd if we find ourselves in government. The Greens taking a very similar position there. But the question is, who would Plaid Cymru have to work with in the event that they were either the largest party or the party that ended up trying to form a government if Reform was the largest party and failed to get a First Minister elected? And I think that's the really big question for Wales, because it may well be, particularly given some of the polling we've seen this week, that Plaid Cymru would not simply be able to just rely on the Greens to get them over the threshold, and then you'd have two pro-independence parties in government. If they have to work with some of the other parties, particularly Welsh Labour, and that is another can of worms that we can talk about another time if that is the case. It's hard to see how that smaller either coalition partner or confidence and supply partner or whatever it might be would be willing to work alongside what they might perceive as an independence agenda.
And of course, confidence and supply is that arrangement where basically a party says, oh yeah, we'll vote for the major things that keep you in office, but we're not actually going into full coalition government with you. A reminder of what the DUP did for Theresa May. Right, Alex, what would be your take on it from a Westminster point of view, if it's kind of 3-1, 3 nationalist governments to 1 unionist government?
Yeah, well, I mean, we know the Westminster position in response to the SNP's argument that if they win a majority in the Holyrood elections, then that should lead to a second independence referendum is a firm no. So it's like that kind of, the notion that they would obviously resist, I think, certainly the Labour government and the Conservatives, those more traditional parties of Westminster, or traditionally bigger parties of Westminster, will resist anything that they would suggest could lead to the breakup of the union in their perspective. But I do think that kind of big constitutional question is just starting to filter into people's minds. And in fact, I was in Northern Ireland with Any Questions a fair few months ago now in Belfast, and there people were actively considering, and this was some way out from this set of elections, what it would mean if that ended up being the situation, and whether or not it would push that kind of bigger constitutional question further up the agenda. So I think it's a consideration that people certainly are starting to wake up to.
Felicity, thank you very much.
Pleasure, thank you.
James, great to catch up.
Thanks, Adam. Great to see you.
And Alex, thank you for your excellent motoring potholing knowledge.
I'm glad that we got the pothole debate going. Cheers, Adam.